Hello, welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's a great pleasure to welcome today's program, Till Dengel, who is Global Head of Digital Logistics Solutions Management at SAP. And today we're going to talk about supply chain resilience, why it's a high priority today. So, historically, supply chain professionals have focused their efforts on reducing costs and improving efficiency, but while also obviously meeting customer service expectations. But today, however, it's becoming important for companies not just to balance costs and efficiency, but to balance it with something else, and that is supply chain resilience. So why is supply chain resilience becoming a high priority today? How can supply chain technologies help companies create and maintain a resilient supply chain, and which capabilities are most important? Well, those are the main questions we're going to discuss in today's episode, and it's great to have Till on the program to share his insights and perspective on this topic. So Till, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Adrian. Very happy to be here. Good to see you again.
Yes, likewise. So Till, you and I know each other, gosh, maybe 15, 20 years. I don't think I've ever asked you this question, though, which is a question that I often ask first-time guests to Talking Logistics. And that is, before we dive into the topic, I'm always curious, how people get involved in this industry. So why don't you briefly tell us a little bit about your career path, how and why you got involved with supply chain logistics, and what your current role and responsibilities are there at SAP?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been a few years that we know each other, Adrian, definitely. And so I started with SAP in 2000, actually, so 22 years ago. Prior to SAP, I worked at DHL, both on the air and ocean side and also on the logistics side. And then in 2000, that got me into SAP as a senior consultant around supply chain. And since then, I've been with SAP mostly around the supply chain domain. So I've been leading our industry business unit for travel and transportation, so the rail, the carriers, the freight forwarders, the airlines for 8 years. And then I also incubated a business, or helped to incubate a business for a couple of years around data monetization, so a completely different topic. And then a few years back, I came back into supply chain, and I now look after the digital logistics piece of our supply chain software, which is mainly around transportation, warehouse management, our fulfillment solutions, and the networks. Yeah.
Great. Well, I started my journey as an industry analyst in 1999. So we've known each other then for 22 plus years for sure, because I think we both got to know each other early on in my career there. And it's great. So it sounds like, obviously you got your DHL, you got your start at supply chain logistics there at SAP, kind of focus somewhere else. But eventually the pull of supply chain, brought you back into the industry. And certainly this is one of the most exciting and dynamic areas to be in. And of course, the topic that we're talking about today, supply chain resilience, is one of them. So let's get started here. In a survey that we recently conducted with members of our Indago supply chain community, and these are all supply chain executives from manufacturing, retail, and distribution companies. More than 3/4 of the respondents, 76%, said that making their supply chains more resilient is either a very high priority or a high priority today. So I guess my first question is, does that result surprise you? And why has supply chain resilience become a high priority today?
Yeah, it's first I have to say it's not surprising, right? I mean, what we hear every day from our customers goes in the same direction. And I think also if you read other studies, they conclude in the same form and fashion. I mean, it's interesting, right? So for me, the last 18, 20 months that we've been through COVID, it was the first time in my lifetime that I went to the supermarket and you've seen empty shelves, right? And then, of course, we've been through all different kinds of shortages and crises in different dimensions, right? I remember the Suez Canal blocking that was very present here in Europe, right? And then resulting from that, you had congestion at the ports, and then in North America, a shortage in workforce. And I can also see this here because many of the workers that have been in supply chain related jobs now have shifted into other jobs, and we see a shortage here. So it's definitely a big topic, and that's the same thing that we hear from our customers. So customers in the last, I would say, 20, 18 months have approached us and said, what can we do to bring solutions in supply chain to market more quickly, right? How can we more quickly get a market, get a warehouse up and running? How can we ensure that, if we can't deliver from one region, we can deliver from another region by implementing, for example, new transportation management systems, things like that. So customers were really very actively looking for software solutions to cope with this problem.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think, certainly, COVID served as a catalyst, for a lot of the challenges that companies around the world started having with supply chains. And I think it underscored, I mean, those of us that are in the industry, we all understand that, supply chains are global, that supply chains are all aspects of supply chain are interconnected. But I think the broader public kind of understood that what happens in China, what happens in other parts of the world ultimately has a ripple effect and impacts all of us. And I think the past 2 years has continued to shown that with the whether you want to call it the bullwhip effect of what happened with COVID, and then certainly some of the ongoing underlying issues that have been happening for a while. But I think that COVID brought it to the surface. Like you said, labor constraints has been an issue not only here in the U.S. but in Europe and other parts of the world as well. So there's many different driving forces that are, I think, making companies really focus on this area in terms of not only how do we respond to COVID, but more importantly, how do we prepare our supply chains for the future? Because some of these things are, hopefully sooner rather than later, we put COVID behind us, some of these other factors are going to remain, moving forward. So I think that's where a lot of companies are today. In the same survey, we asked our Indago members, how would you rate your current supply chain logistics technology capabilities relative to making your supply chain, more resilient? And only 32%, again, 32% of the respondents rated their technology capabilities as either excellent or good in terms of helping them make their supply chains more resilient. And more than half of the respondents, 56%, rated their technology capabilities as only fair. Again, do these results surprise you? And what are some of the, I guess, historical technology challenges or limitations that companies face?
Yeah, also here, I wouldn't say it's a big surprise, right? So I think what happened in the last, 10, 15 years was that logistics and supply chain was looked at from an efficiency perspective, right? So everything, it was squeezing out cost, getting most out of your supply chain. And you've talked about how global supply chains are, right? Sourcing from very far away. And that on the other side, that makes supply chains very vulnerable, right? Because it's, your suppliers are far away, you have long distances to cover. And that's what we've been feeling through COVID, when suddenly, the supplier base was not accessible because, ports were shut down, or because, trucks couldn't cross borders and things like that. I think that's what we're now seeing. So in my perspective, what's changing is it's moving from efficiency to more of a focus of, how can I differentiate using my supply chain? How can I use my supply chain in my favor on one side so I can deliver to my customers, and on the other side, so I can serve my customers in the best way, right? So I think that's been happening. And in my perspective, logistics and supply chain got a lot more focus and is now more and more part of a boardroom discussion again. So it's not just cost, it's really that differentiation and what can I do different as part of also the product experience. How can I bring in also the delivery experience into a bigger experience for my customers? So that's, in my perspective, what's been happening. And in COVID, what we've seen is that many customers were just stranded because they didn't have visibility. They didn't know where the goods were, and they could not react because they couldn't see what was going on. So that for me was the strongest thing that we've seen in the last couple of months, is that companies are focusing on getting that visibility. And I mean, you can look into the VC area, venture capital, how much venture capital is flowing around in that space, and how many, how companies are valued in this space. So that's a very hot space, but that's just the beginning, of that entire chain. You get the visibility, but then what do you do with it? Do you have the agility to react? What can you quickly do to then, still serve your customers, change your supply chain, adapt your supply chain? And that's where other technology comes in beyond just the visibility piece. We had a lot of requests in COVID for warehouse management system, right? How can I bring up a new warehouse because I suddenly have to get my goods from a different supplier? How can I bring up a new warehouse very quickly? We had requests like, how can I bring in a cobot in the warehouse so I can keep social distancing rules? we had lots of requests for transportation management, right? So I get the visibility from any of the visibility providers in our logistics network, but what do you then do with it? How can you replan your transportation, or how can you source a different carrier, for example, and things like that. So there's been many examples across the entire logistics field. And if I have to bring it together, one thing that we also still see a lot, coming back to the beginning of the question, is that a lot of information still sits in silos, right? A lot of our companies we talk to, they have a different system in Asia than they have in the US, than they have in Europe. Still, it's a global supply chain, and they need to distribute information equally across these systems, which is not always happening. So there's still a lot of siloed information and manual processes in between.
You raised a lot of great points there. The fact that data and systems continue to be highly distributed. I think the other point related to that is, in some of those cases, companies are working with systems that were developed back in the 1990s or even 1980s. So they're not even, modern, types of technology. So they create these kind of black holes. And of course, there's still a lot of manual processing, that takes place. You also mentioned how, this has now been raised to the level of the C-level suite, supply chain logistics, which I think is if there's anything positive about the COVID pandemic, I think that's one of the positive things, that it's now, if they weren't before, CEOs, CFOs, and everyone in the C-suite now has a much greater appreciation for supply chain logistics, and understanding that it's not just about being a cost center, that this is a risk management type of perspective as well, customer service perspective, and then there's competitive differentiation here as well. I remember one of the internet memes that was going around related to digital transformation, and I wish I could remember who to give credit to, but it was something along the lines of, what served as the catalyst for your digital transformation efforts? Was it your CEO? Was it your CEO, CFO? Was it your CIO? And the answer was no, it was the COVID, the COVID. And I think that's true for a lot of companies, where COVID really has served as that catalyst for digital transformation. Do you see that as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've seen bits of investment in some of these areas, but especially around visibility. That's where COVID came in, where suddenly everybody was blindsided, didn't know where the goods were, and that was the first request. How can I get more visibility? And then everything else followed. And you can also see that many companies use the time during COVID to really rethink their supply chains, right? What do we have to do better in the future? How can we be more resilient? How can we be more agile? So they're really strategically looking at their supply chains, but they're also looking at the underlying systems and how can they renovate the systems that they work with day to day.
So you mentioned visibility, and certainly that is a hot topic. I think it's been a hot topic since 1999 and 2000. Of course, how to enable visibility and the technology and everything else around that has evolved over the past 22 years, like much of it. So this leads me to my next question. In addition to visibility, moving forward, what will be some of the most, important supply chain technology capabilities that companies must have to create and maintain a resilient supply chain?
Yeah, I would start with having a strong supply chain backbone, right? Everything from taking the order, getting the order, confirming and promising the delivery date to the customer, then all the way through picking, packing, delivery, transportation, final delivery, and then that visibility that you want to share with your customers. So I think having that backbone in place that's robust and that's scalable, and that you can, that has somewhat of a elasticity if you need to, for peak seasons, for example, if you need to ramp it up and then maybe after Christmas ramp it down again. So that's one thing, having that backbone. And then on top of that, I think there's a lot of innovation that can also support being more resilient. So one is the visibility piece. One is a big one for us is the network piece, right? How can I work better with my business partners? So if I don't find a supplier or carrier in one area, how can I quickly find somebody else in my network in an automated way, not over the phone, over email, but how can I quickly tender, for example, to an Uber Freight to find somebody to move the load? Or how can I tender into my network? So I think networks is a very big piece here to give you that agility and flexibility that you need. And then the other adjacent area that I see is automation in the warehouse, right? One is fully automated warehouses, which of course you do in your big distribution centers, but even in smaller warehouse operations, having more and more robotics So you can bridge peak times, for example, and you can just support your workforce with additional additional movements and additional peaks that are coming in. And then the last one I would like to mention is the risk management part of it, right? That you don't just tactically and operationally look at visibility, but that you really identify risks as they come in. And there's many providers out there that give you risk management data, for example, for weather patterns coming in, or if something else happens in your supply chain, and then project that on your supply chain to see what locations will be impacted in the coming days, what shipments that I have planned will be impacted in the coming days, and how can I use the time that I still have, 2-3 days maybe before such a bad weather comes in, to react and to be proactive. I think that's going to be a very big topic going forward.
A lot of great points. I mean, I'm a big proponent of networks and, the role that connected networks play in, enabling, supply chain resilience and, and helping to, bring particularly the long tail of suppliers and carriers and other trading partners into the, the ecosystem that companies have, to work with. When you talked about thinking about the whole order to cash process or order to pay process, it brings me back to that, classic Harvard Business Review article about staple yourself to a purchase order and really, understanding, kind of map that whole process. And I think if you do that and then understand where are the technology touch points that go along with every step in that process, you'll be able to identify where the weak links are. And I think, we don't talk about, ERP that much these days, or at least it's not. But I think this is when you talk about the order management piece and the financial piece, everything else. That's a critical component of this, right? Even though it's not quote unquote sexy anymore to talk about ERP, but that is for a lot of companies. When you mentioned backbone, that is part of that backbone, right? Yeah,
that's the robust backbone, and then aside on the order management is the start of the process, and then also in the end, the finish of the process is basically the finance and the controlling, right? So also talking about, we like to talk a lot about transportation management systems around optimization of the load and 3D load planning, all the fancy stuff. But I think there is still a lot of efficiency gains to be made in automatically charging, automatically creating the credit note for your carriers without touching it, right? And then transferring the data into your finance system and into your controlling system to eventually keep track of the accruals and everything. So I think in those spaces that are, like you say, they're not the most sexy because they're not fancy, they're not using, that much new technology, but I think that's where you can still gain a lot of efficiency out of the systems and the interplay between the different areas of the business, right? Transportation with the finance department, or transportation in the beginning of the process with the customer service department, for example.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think the other aspect with going back to the networks piece, I think one of the key enablers of the cloud, of the network, has been the move toward, the cloud technology. I think for a lot of companies, particularly going back to what happened with COVID, for a lot of companies that were still reliant on, let's say, client server applications that were in-house, and now they had to work from home and they really had no way to, access their business systems, those are the companies that really felt the pain the most. So I would think that kind of, for companies that have been laggards and moving to cloud technology, I think taking a look at cloud, moving toward the cloud, I think it has to be another, I would imagine, be another component to what's going to be important moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And for different reasons, right? One is the strategic reason, like you just said, that you can work from anywhere, right? It helps with the business transformation. You can bring up systems more quickly. You have more elasticity just in the compute power that you may need, which is one part of the coin. The other piece is then, of course, CapEx versus OpEx, right? Which is a big topic in the logistics field. And then, of course, there is a lot of IT benefits that you would get in terms of TCO, in terms of process standardization. And for me, the biggest thing in the cloud is not all the IT related stuff and also the commercial side, which of course is important, but that you can do joint business processes with your carriers, for example, right? So if I look at our logistics business network, the shipper and the carrier work on the same business document in the same system. They share the same information, and that goes all the way from tendering the load to managing the dock appointment to eventually managing the dispute. So you handle the dispute before you transfer to your controlling and finance system, right? So it's really managing joint business processes on a single source of information. which is for me the major benefit of cloud.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I think we often talk about the importance of collaboration, in this industry, and communication as well. And I think that's where, again, to kind of reinforce that point, or underscore that point, that's where the cloud really, has some great, benefits, is in truly helping companies walk the talk with regard to, collaboration and communication and joint business, processing. So Till, as a way to wrap up then, I mean, what questions then should companies ask themselves to assess where they are today, and what actions they should take moving forward with regards to creating a more resilient supply chain?
Good one. I think I would break it down into three questions, right? One is, do I have the visibility in place, right? Can I know at any point in time where my goods are? And can I, provide this information to my customers and to my own department so they can be, they can react and they are able to do something? So do I have that visibility, and do I have the risk management practices in place to work based on that visibility that I have? I think that's the first question. And then the follow-on question is, do I have the agility, right? Even if I have the information that something will be late, can I react, right? So do I have the connectivity, for example, into a network if I know that, one carrier falls short, or that the ocean leg will be late, and I need to shift from barge to truck in the last leg? Do I have the flexibility, the agility to actually move to and find a different carrier quickly? And that is, I think, in transportation, that's one area, but also in other areas of the business, right? Do I have that flexibility if a worker calls in the morning in the warehouse and says, I'm sick, that I can still run the operations with my workforce and maybe, complement that workforce with automation, with cobots, with things like that. And then the third one is, do I have more of the long-term flexibility, right? So let's say what I've seen a lot during COVID was where companies had, single suppliers, for example, in China, now moving into different suppliers by region, right? That they have certain suppliers in the Asia Pacific region, some in Europe, some in the Americas region. And then if one of the regions falls short, or one of the suppliers in the regions fall short, can I still supply maybe from another region, right? So do I have that long-term flexibility to deal with these kind of demands and these kinds of shifts that I may have coming in the future? So that for me is the three different questions, from very operational into more strategic in the end.
Yeah, no, those are three great questions to kind of get started, for sure. And like I always say at the end of all these episodes, we always, this is such a meaty topic. We could probably spend an entire day talking about this. But I will mention that some of the research that we talked about today, and some of these topics we're going to discuss further in an upcoming research report that's going to be published in the near future here. So keep an eye out for that. We'll again go into a little bit more detail on some of the data that we talked about today, and some of these topics. But Till, again, thank you very much for making the time to be with us today and sharing your insights and perspective on this topic.
Thank you. Very happy to be here, and happy to talk again.
Great. I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the SAP website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for Till, feel free to post it there, and I'm sure that he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.